a lot of people felt that the damage really was strictly in the actual weapon itself and the untraining the weapon ability, not the actual like special ability you may have had, like Berserk and Melee and Double. Right. And again, I really don't know how true it was. It seemed like it was, but I don't know. But they never, after talking to people, they never explained why Shapeshift was on the miss point. I guess it was just a design flaw. And we never got a point in Shapeshift once they figured out that like kind of like the that you could just adjust the level of the form itself, and then all the problems were like gone. So, right. But failing to Shapeshift was like the worst possible feeling ever. It really is like. Yeah. It's like, all right, well, we just fail at what we do. Like this kind of like this is what the job was based solely around.
In some of those cases, I have to imagine too. You failed the Shapeshift, you're like, okay, I'm dead. Now she just like.
Well, yeah, because you basically just gave yourself a 2-second timer. If you failed the shape, you would have a 2-second timer for failing.
Right.
And that's if you had good enough agility, because if anyone remembers when the DM decided to nerf the entire game. Because a lot of agility. So to get a pure 2-second timer in DFC, on a lot of jobs, you needed the quick attack skill. There was like you had like quick spell, quick attack, quick skill, and stuff like that. So you needed that ability. Yeah, you needed that ability for whatever it is what you're doing. So if you want to do a general skill, like climb or jump or something like that, or swim, you needed the quick skill ability, along with a 28% agility in order to achieve a flat 2-second timer. Now, when I first started playing, a lot of the agility items like Dragon Wing boots and stuff like that would give you 11% or 9%. It was like 11 or 9. I had to look. I think it was 11. And that was enough to, on my shitty roll at least, as a wolf, to get my 2-second timer. Because that was essential. Like you needed to have a 2-second timer to really be competitive in that game. If you could achieve it. Like there's certain jobs in that game who would never, ever, ever, ever be able to achieve a 2-second timer or whatever the base timer it is for whatever they're doing. Dwarves were a really good example of that. Dwarves, it was almost impossible, I think. Zombies, I think that was very difficult for them as well. They both just had really shitty agility stats.
Right.
And in certain jobs, for example, like you needed a minimum of like a 19 agility with a 19% bonus. Like that's for necromancers, like that was the baseline. You needed a 19 agility because the way bonuses work too is every stat when you created your character had a range of what percentages you can get. So like 19, for example, 19 agility on a necromancer, you could end up getting a 17, 18, or 19 percentage. So it wasn't guaranteed that if you rolled a 19 agility on a necromancer that you would get the 19 you needed in order to wear an agility 2 item to get that 28%. So you needed a 19 with a high bonus of a 19% in order to achieve that. So that was the other issue that made rolling such a pain in the ass for a lot of people, because you couldn't always get what you wanted. Even when you got the number on face value of what you needed, you had to actually create the character, log into the game, and actually look and see what your percentage bonus was, and there was no guarantee that you were going to get what you needed, and that caused a lot of people to wipe, and that also probably facilitated the desire to create things like auto rollers in the game, because rolling was just a terrible aspect of the game. I mean, I liked the idea, but it really was boring as shit, and you would get pissed off when you'd roll like a really good stats, but the bonuses that you would actually see were terrible.
Yeah, no, that's one thing. I commented on that a little bit, which is I liked it because it made you have flaws as well as strengths. So it kind of balanced you out if you hand rolled them or had a shitty auto roller. But I think if you have 19, 18, 19, 18 everywhere, then it's like, okay, you might as well just make your own stats. So
I mean, when I started the game again, like I was very, very competitive on Nyx with the stats that he had, believe it or not, and the skills that they had. Like I was able to really hold my weight and pull my weight rather, and be really competitive and really good. And I mean, I think maybe if I had those stats in almost any other job, like I wouldn't have been able to be that competitive. But the gear, the level of the gear was really good back then too. So I was able to have like achieve a 2-second timer. It wasn't until the game kind of got overhauled by DM and what was called like the great tones of the game, that kind of like Nyx wasn't really as good as he was, and probably not as good as he should have been in the first place. For what his stats were, because I had like a 16 agility and like a 17% bonus, so at that point it was impossible unless I had a speed 3 item. Like if you look in my logs, like I had like an item called a White Star Emblem, which is one of the few speed 3 items in the game left. And I couldn't invade with that, because it would be impossible to replace. And so like that's at that point I kind of like got in at a good time with the game, and after the changes, like I was already kind of where I needed to be. Like I was already max rank, and I was well on my way to 75, and like I had my all like really good gear where like the changes didn't matter anyway. But anyone else who was coming into the game at that time, if you didn't roll those certain stats, particularly in Agile, like you were kind of food for a lot of players. Like you just weren't as good.
Well, they definitely weren't. But looking at all these logs of the kind of long-term players that started early on and ended up being fairly big and strong, they didn't have great stats. Some people had 16 agility. Like
very few players did.
Yeah, it's true. But I feel that there's a degree of being accepting the fact and just playing the game and enjoying it and still being a strong player.
I mean, because a lot of those players, again, had the benefit of, again, having played the game for so long, so they know a lot of the nuances. I mean, if you speak to Cruz or Polo, whatever you want, I mean, he mentioned that before when I was making fun of him. I was talking to him about how he hated my Revenant. I was probably one of the first players to really take advantage of, like swim timers and climb timers and jump timers on my Revenant. So I would really take advantage of swims and just use hide and sneak to my advantage. And so at that point, like my agility didn't really matter because you would swim into the room and then I would just kill you. You were locked. You couldn't do anything. Or I would hide in like on a climb or a jump, and I knew someone was coming for me. I'd wait for them. And then having familiars too really helped with like kind of anticipating who was coming for me and things like that. And a lot of people followed suit. I know at a certain point, McWiz and Morrow and stuff like that, they would do the same thing. They would go in, they would invade Tamia, and they would jump into like Southern Werve's docks and just like rip people apart because people would swim into the room. They wouldn't even bother hiding because like you didn't need. A lot of people didn't know that. Like, you didn't need to actually have the hide skill to hide and sneak, particularly in swims. Once you were hidden, you generally, unless you kind of got the drown mechanic, like the severely failing of a swim, where you took a lot of damage, you didn't come out of hiding. You could swim and you wouldn't come out. And some people would just swim into my room without even being hidden and get murdered for whatever reason. They'd do it over and over and over again, just feed me RPs.
Right.
Yeah, I saw a lot of you doing the tracking. You were doing the most of it in like the Raijin Coast and Raijin Harbor.
That was
a lot.
Yeah, I mean that was the thing too with track, how it worked. Anyone who actually was familiar with the track class had to understand how to really manipulate it to be effective, be an effective tracker. Unfortunately, I didn't have volley. So I couldn't, like when you were mentioning with a high level null, like what they would do is really smart. I couldn't do that. But there was a lot of things that you could do with track, and there's a lot of ways to dump track. So a good way to use track, especially against like wizards, you couldn't really utilize it on ogres very well because they actually had like anti-scry and stuff like that, but you could backtrack. So you could actually follow back where someone came from and kind of figure out where their like the teleport markers were. Because tracks, and then there was also at a certain point, tracks would fade. If they got too far, tracks would fade. So you really had to keep in touch with people, and tracks also didn't work on through swims. You couldn't track through swims. You couldn't tell what direction through swims now.
That's actually a cool mechanic. I didn't even notice that.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able. You would just say the tracks end in this room, and if it was swims, and that would be it, even if they weren't in the room because it was a swim. Same thing with climbs and jumps. You couldn't track through climbs and jumps. You would just know better with climbs and jumps which way they went because there would only usually be one climb or one jump. But swims, there was multiple directions. So unless you actually saw what way they went, like you would have to just get lucky.
Yeah, it's one of those things where the skill doesn't do all the work for you.
No, but it was things like that which made the game kind of like cool. Like there was little nuances that certain people like myself and a lot of other players kind of knew and took advantage of to be successful. And whether you thought it was cheap or not, I mean, that kind of just was part of the game. Do I think it was by design? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that was by design. I mean, it never was serious enough to be addressed in any manner. Like there was like was it? Do you think it was by design, for example, that like I could like follow a monster and have the monster take me past a wall? You know, for example, like that's something that I could have done all the time. I had familiars. I could get myself past walls, but I never did it easily. But that's something that was addressed. Like that was deemed illegal. Shadowing players past walls was deemed illegal, even though shadow was a perfectly legitimate skill. I don't see why that was deemed illegal. You should have been able to do that. You know, that became an issue. So you were dependent on in invasions to have like your teleporters, like Coven and Nosferatu and ogres and wizards, like to transport past the walls or blink past walls and like try and snatch up all the ammunition in order to beat out Dockslaughters. And we kind of like get screwed over with certain skills which could have been strategically really powerful. Shadow could have been really, really powerful if I could have had like if we could have had like our imps or kobolds and rogue shadow enemy players pass walls and be effective. You know, things like that. There's a lot of little things like that were deemed to be illegal or not fair, which I think kind of like should have been allowed, I guess, but everyone has their own opinion of things.
And everyone is wrong.
Maybe. I mean, ask Crows. I mean, he played a rogue, right? Like, do you think that you should have been allowed to shadow players past walls? Like, why not? I mean, that was kind of like that was like the purpose of the skill, right? Like,
it is, but it isn't, because you have two, functions working against each other. You have the function of, hey, I'm a wall, I'm supposed to not allow you pass. So,
but how do you pass a wall? I mean, if you want to think logically, right? So how did that player to begin with pass the wall? How did he pass the wall? Just because it's a good aligned? I mean, is it transparent? Is he able to walk past the wall? Is there not a door? Do you know what I mean? Like, how does he get around the wall?
Yeah, I get true, that. I do.
Does he scale it? You know what I mean? Like, how does he get past the wall? So whatever way he took, maybe if you're shadowing, you learned how to pass the wall, and you're able to pass the wall with him. Do you get what I'm saying? I mean, I
get it.
We'll just change it to etherealize, and it costs 50 points to train.
Yeah, I mean, that makes more sense too. So, I mean, if you want to do something like that, but I mean, again, strategically, I think it would have been a cool feature. Fair-wise, I don't know, who's to say. I mean, there was a lot of things that were kind of like touched upon.
I mean, that's kind of one of those fun debates to have for fun, because ultimately, it was an older time, so the technology was not as advanced, and the code itself was not as advanced. But B, and probably more importantly, is that it's a rule that is in place to allow you to experience the game as they want you to experience it. So when you play Monopoly, there's rules in Monopoly. So if you don't abide by those rules, then you're not playing Monopoly anymore. So it's the same.
Exactly,
concept.
and then, but there's also house rules too, right? So that to me was sort of like a house rule, like you cannot shadow players past walls, right? Yeah. But you could still shadow players. I mean, that was a really, really strong tactic, especially during tracking. You could shadow like your like as a rogue or an imp, you could shadow your own realm mate and let them track, and then wait for someone to attack them, and then